I was asked to come and explain bubbles to a crypto audience, which I thought would be an interesting conversation. And it's kind of interesting looking at this that I first started working on crypto in 2013. I joined Andreessen Horowitz in 2014, back when Bitcoin was still this kind of funny little curiosity that only people like Balaji talked about. In fact, I knew Balaji before he was Balaji. He actually had a surname back then. And so now here we are 10 years later, and I was asked to talk about the history of bubbles. And I thought it would be useful to refer to a kind of canonical phrase, "this time is different," which is what people always say in a bubble. People always say this time is different. The challenge is that they're generally right. Every bubble is different. It always is. Something has changed, something is new. There's some reason why this isn't the same as it was before. The dot-com bubble didn't look anything like the Japanese bubble, which didn't look anything like 1987 or 1974. Every bubble is different. Every bubble has changed. And yet it can still be a bubble. And so I thought it would be interesting to talk about what that means, but also talk about the trouble with saying that things are bubbles. And so the first observation would be that in a bubble, everything will work. If we talk about how technologies evolve, there's generally a kind of a classic S-curve, where to begin with, every new technology is stupid, it's useless, it's a toy, it won't scale, it's not good for anything, it's a dumb toy for rich teenagers. And then there's a period when it starts working, and it's very exciting, and you want your children to get a job in it, or you want to get a job in it. And this is also a period when you tend to have fraud, and you tend to have bubbles. And then there's a period when it's boring, because everything works, and it's become mature, and everything's been built. And so this is where smartphones are today. The new iPhone came out last week. It's amazing, but nobody's very excited because it's pretty much the same as the iPhone the year before. On the other hand, something like VR and AR are right at the beginning of this process. They don't really work yet. It's not clear what they're good for. It's easy to dismiss them as a toy. And so new technologies that become important tend to go through this process. On the other hand, there are also technologies that are just moving from being a toy to being exciting. And so this is where crypto might be, this is where large language models are today. However, just because that process exists doesn't mean that every technology goes through it. There's also a bunch of technologies that didn't work or didn't become huge or moved off into a niche, things like 3D printing or drones. Sort of 5 or 6 years ago, everybody bought a drone for Christmas, and then 3 days later you said, well, I've seen the roof of my house now, and it turned out that drones weren't a mass market technology. So you can't just kind of presume that everything will follow that process. And so if we think about how people tend to talk about technology, or new technologies, we've got kind of equal and opposite fallacies. On the one hand, people will say it's a toy, and on the other hand, people will say, well, people always say that. Everyone always says it's a toy. People said that the iPhone was a toy, therefore this new thing will work. The fact that people are saying it's a toy proves it's going to work. And you don't have to think very long to realize that there's kind of a logical flaw in that. There's a great quote from Carl Sagan 20 or 30, 40 or 50 years ago, who said that they laughed at Columbus, they laughed at the Wright brothers, but they also laughed at Bozo the Clown. So just because they're laughing at you doesn't mean it's going to work. On the other hand, of course, it's not going to be a big thing unless people are laughing at you. But just to look at this point about the Wright brothers, there's kind of a useful distinction to draw here. On the one hand, this is the Wright brothers' first aircraft, and it flew 100, 150 yards. It carried one person. It's pretty easy to look at this and say, well, this is useless, it won't scale. But of course, it did scale, and 5 or 6 years later, Blériot flew across the channel, and people were flying hundreds of miles. So if you looked at this and said it's useless, you're missing the point. You had to understand that this was going to get much better very quickly. On the other hand, most of us don't own one of these. This is a Bell rocket pack from about 1960. It's amazing, you can fly, but you can only fly for about 30 seconds because that's how much hydrogen peroxide you can carry on your back. And the only way that you can fly for a minute is to carry twice as much hydrogen peroxide, and that's too heavy, you can't. So there was no way for this thing to scale beyond flying for 30 seconds. So it was very cool in 1960, and it's still very cool, but there was no way that it could become any better. Another kind of useful quote for thinking about this comes from a theoretical physicist called Wolfgang Pauli, who was asked to look at a student's work, and his colleague said, I don't think it's very good. And he looked at it and he said, it's worse than that, it's not even wrong. That is to say, it was a theory. It was something that wasn't actually a theory. It wasn't a hypothesis. There was nothing that you could test. There was no question you could ask that would tell you whether this is true or false. And that's a challenge with a lot of people looking at early stages of technology, is people make statements that don't really have any predictive value. They make statements that are not even wrong. And so when you look at a new thing, instead of saying that won't work, or people always say that, you have to say, well, what would have to change? What would we have to believe? Is there a roadmap for this to become useful? Is there a roadmap for this to work? What do we have to believe for this to become important? What do we have to believe if we think this isn't going to be important? Meanwhile, in a bubble, not only will everything work, but everything will work right now. There's an old saying in the stock market, what's the difference between being early and being wrong? And the answer is nothing. Some people in the room may even have owned one of these things. This is the Apple Newton from the mid-1990s. This was the future, but it was 10, maybe 15 years too early. And the history of tech is full of things that were the right idea in a directional sense, but they were too early. Hence, my old boss, Mark Andreessen, liked to say that all of the failed ideas from the dot-com bubble would work now. Not literally all of them, but almost all of them would kind of work now, because we've got enough people, we've got enough infrastructure. Hence, something like e-commerce has now reached sort of 15 to 20% in most developed markets, more in China, more in the UK. But it took 20 years to do that. And there were people in 1999 who were saying it was going to happen next year. It's kind of worth pointing out, incidentally, this is basically the most boring chart in the tech industry, because it just grew 1% every year for 20 years. Then there was that kind of brief surge in the pandemic, and now we've gone exactly back onto the trend line, like there's some kind of physical law that shapes how this works. You can see something very similar in the enterprise, incidentally. If you're in the tech industry, then cloud is old and boring and done, and that's something from the past. But the cloud is still only sort of 20 to 30% of enterprise workflows. And it takes a long time for big companies to change how they do things. It takes a long time for consumers to change how they do things. And meanwhile, the old model can hang around for a long time. IBM is still selling mainframes. Mainframes are still out there inside big companies doing big company things. In fact, IBM is selling record mainframe capacity every year as they carry on shifting Moore's law into banks and airlines and insurance companies and government tax offices. So they're still there, it's just that they became irrelevant. Meanwhile, if we push forward into how that can evolve, this is a chart of smartphone sales. Smartphone sales don't start with the iPhone. They start arguably in the mid-90s, but really they start in sort of 2000, 2001 with things like Palm and BlackBerry and Nokia Series 60. It took a decade of people selling those devices for the sales really to pick up. And when the sales did pick up, it wasn't the early winners. It wasn't Nokia, it wasn't BlackBerry, it wasn't Microsoft, it wasn't Palm. Meanwhile, in 2000, mobile operators spent something over $100 billion buying spectrum to run these services. It took 10 years before anybody did anything with it, and they never made any money from that spectrum either. All the money went to Apple and Google. And so there's kind of pulling this chart apart, be careful about the early winners. This is another example of the same thing. These are PC unit share. We've got Apple down here in the bottom, and we all kind of know that Apple pioneered the market but then lost the PC market. But there were also something like a dozen other companies that were selling different kinds of microcomputer and PC in the late 70s and early 80s. And so not only was Apple never the majority, but the IBM PC wasn't the majority until the mid-1980s either. None of those companies are still around. So be careful of looking at the early winners. Be careful of thinking how quickly it's going to work. This is a chart of market caps of the 6 largest companies today versus the 6 largest companies in the dot-com bubble. And there's kind of an interesting spread here, because on the one hand, the biggest companies today are much larger, but on the other hand, the valuations are much lower. Cisco back into the spring of 2000 was at a PE 100. And so this is really a chart about the promise of what might happen versus the reality of what does happen. And when it becomes real. Incidentally, you can also see Space Karen here in the middle. One of these is not like the other. That's a question about Tesla being valued effectively as a company that's all about the future, as opposed to other large tech companies that are being valued about what they have today. Meanwhile, of course, if you look at these companies, how many of these won the internet? I don't think anybody thinks that Oracle was a big winner from the rise of the internet. Arguably, the only company on here that is even significant in the internet is Microsoft, and that's kind of an also-ran in the consumer internet. And so all of the companies that were being given the highest valuations in the dot-com bubble ended up not really making any money, or certainly not being the biggest winners out of the dot-com bubble. Now, if you go back a little bit further, this is a chart from 1995, a diagram from 1995 of the internet, except that back then there wasn't just the internet. There were lots of other networks as well. And so there were private networks and Fido and BitNet and Minitel and AOL and God knows what else. And meanwhile, within the internet, it wasn't clear how that was going to work. It wasn't clear it was just going to be the web. It wasn't clear that how the web was going to work. It wasn't clear whether a web browser should be an editor, whether this was document sharing or publishing. Absolutely nothing about how the internet was going to evolve was clear for 10, 15 years, really until the late 90s or the early 2000s. And so you could have put an awful lot of money into Delphi and CompuServe and FidoNet and believed in the future of the internet and got absolutely nowhere. No one really knows anything about how the future is going to evolve. It's certainly not like the last 10%, which is where all the money is there to be made. Meanwhile, in a bubble, it was obvious in hindsight. So we've all seen lots of bubble charts, but I thought this one is kind of fun. This is the market cap of Zoom versus Exxon in the pandemic. There was a brief moment when Zoom was worth more than the world's biggest oil company, and even at the time that seemed kind of silly. There were a lot of reasons why Zoom didn't have a moat, Zoom wasn't defensible. In the time, it was kind of obvious. Of course this is a bubble. Of course this is ridiculous. And you can look at something like Metaverse. Obviously, nobody here was ever interested in Metaverse, but there were other people who thought that Metaverse was going to be a big deal. There may still be in another 10 years once Mark Zuckerberg has spent another $75 billion on it. Nobody talks about Metaverse anymore. Of course, one should also point out a similar chart for crypto, which was the only thing that anyone in tech wanted to talk about for about 18 months and has now settled back to a slightly more rational level of interest. But of course, you can call bubble about anything. So these are 3 headlines talking about Facebook buying Instagram for $1 billion, which was obviously completely insane and evidence that the world had forgotten the dot-com bubble. Today, Instagram is probably worth $500 billion. Meanwhile, and go back a little bit further, when Yahoo bought Flickr for $15 or $20 million with an M, $20 million for an internet company, that was obviously insane and a sign of that the bubble had returned. There's a classic quote here that's kind of apocryphal that economists have predicted 9 of the last 15 recessions. So it's very easy to call bubble about everything. It's very easy to say this is a bubble, just as it's very easy to say that it's not a bubble. So how can you think about this when you're in it, when by definition you kind of can't know? And so I think there's a few axioms that one can think about. First of all, be careful of people drawing straight lines on log scale charts. Some of you may remember a lot of straight lines on log scale charts around crypto a couple of years ago. That kind of analysis tends not to end very well. In fact, you should probably be careful about straight lines on charts in general. This is NVIDIA's quarterly revenue. Now, I'm not a semis analyst. I'm also not a data center analyst. But I am kind of reminded of the line from The Godfather when Michael Corleone says that if history's taught us anything, it's you can kill anybody. And I think the technology industry equivalent of this is probably that if history has taught us anything, it's that semiconductors are cyclical and commodity technology gets cheap. And of course, that new technologies tend to lead to bubbles. One should also be careful about politics. This is a famous document written by John Perry Barlow, who is part of the Grateful Dead, who wrote, governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace. You have no sovereignty where we gather. There are quite a lot of people in the crypto industry who thought that national governments had no sovereignty and none of the laws apply to them. And as you heard on the previous panel, turns out that real-world laws do apply to crypto just as they apply to anything else. So be careful of politics, be careful of radical politics, be careful of thinking that new politics will change how technologies work. There is an observation that truly transformative technologies very often come with crazy politics because you kind of have to be crazy to believe that you're going to change the world like that. And so that's how a lot of early Silicon Valley happened. It's also how the early internet happened, as we see here. It's what happened with open source. And indeed, a lot of early crypto came with crazy politics. But you kind of have to be cautious about believing that. You have to be cautious of people saying that the old rules don't apply. And just as being careful about politics, you also kind of have to be careful about religions. So open source people were convinced that open source was going to destroy Microsoft, that commercial software was evil, and that nobody was going to buy software anymore. And here we are 25 years later, and the iPhone is full of open source software, but it's not open. But it has millions of apps and billions of downloads, so what does it mean to say that it's not open? And this is kind of the messy reality of how amazingly exciting new ideas get translated into products that billions of people use. The new ideas happen, but at different levels of the stack. And maybe the consumer knows, maybe the consumer doesn't know. Maybe it's important at this level, but not important at that level. ARM is an open standard, but it's not open. iOS is full of open source software, but it's not open, but it has more software installed than any platform in history. So is it open or closed? Well, it kind of depends what you mean, and it depends what level of abstraction you're thinking about. Finally, of course, you should beware of being in a bubble yourself. This is a quote from John Peel, who is a famous British DJ, and he told a story that he said to a friend at a record company, "I can't believe that album wasn't a hit. Everybody I knew bought a copy," and the record exec said, "No, you knew everybody who bought a copy." And I think we can kind of all think of examples of cases where people believe that everyone else thinks the same as them and will make the same product decisions as them and the same purchase decisions as them. And this is kind of a recurring challenge, particularly in the technology industry. We've seen this with everything from GUIs to command lines to smartphones to open source. Be careful of believing that your own product preferences will automatically become a universal preference that everybody else will want to follow. You should also, incidentally, beware of the fear of missing out, which is, of course, the greatest sign of a bubble ever. Most people will remember here Sequoia put up a very long essay talking about how wonderful Sam Bankman-Fried was about 3 days before he was arrested, and then they deleted it from their website. So here we've got a screen grab from Web Archive, because nothing is ever forgotten forever. FOMO is probably the greatest ever signal that you're in a bubble, because the moment that you actually know you're in a bubble is when you say to yourself, well, gee, I don't really understand that thing, and I'm not quite sure why the price is doing what it is, but all these other idiots seem to be getting really rich, so maybe I should have a go too. That is pretty much always a signal that you're 3 to 6 months away from the top of the bubble. The challenge, of course, at that is that you can call a bubble for years before it pops. Hence, another important quote from J.M. Keynes: markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. Calling a market is a very specific kind of skill, and and trading is very different from investing. And that takes me to one more chart. This is the annual return on the S&P back since 1930. In generality, in the long term, the market tends to go up, but every now and then it doesn't. Every time, incidentally, that I go and look at statistics from 1929, 1930, 1931, I generally think I've made a mistake in my spreadsheet. Because you make the chart and you think, wait, no, construction equipment sales can't have gone down 90% in 1931. So, oh, yes, they did. Newspaper sales can't have gone down by 3/4 in 1932. Oh, yes, they did. That's kind of what you're seeing on the left side of this chart. But of course, over the long term, the market goes up. It just wobbles a bit in the meantime, as long as you're sure that you believe in the growth of the US economy. And hence, I'll leave you with one final quote from the man who was the richest man on earth at the time, John D. Rockefeller. The story is that a newspaper reporter asked him what he thought would happen to the stock market, and he said, it will fluctuate. Which has generally been a good way to think about what's going to happen to the stock market in the short term. In the long term, of course, it tends to do something else. And with that, I will say thank you.